Hello, and welcome to Course 5 Compass Live. I'm David McBride from Course 5 Intelligence, coming to you from my home in Lafayette, California today, joined today by my friend and colleague and former boss, Daniel Spinosa. Welcome, Daniel. Daniel, can you hear me? Maybe Daniel's audio will kick in a second here. So I'm really excited to have Daniel as a guest today. Daniel's a CPO and a CFO by training. He was most recently the general manager of the Xfinity video experience, and Daniel brings a financial and analytical mindset to growth. He spent time at AOL, 12 years there, and through his 13 years at Comcast, it brings an analytics and financial alchemy together by joining those teams, those organizations that are often disparate, brings them together to create customer value and top line growth. And we're going to talk about that today. I reported to Daniel for 3 of my 6 years at Comcast, and consistently I refer to the lessons that I learned and ways that we figured out answers to problems together, and he brings a very much a measured perspective to solving analytics and finance problems. So Daniel's now consulting with media companies concerning strategy and growth using customer analytics. So Daniel, welcome to Course 5 Compass Live.
Thank you, Dave. It's great to see you again, and I appreciate it. I think those were the 3 best years of my times at Comcast, so thank you for that.
Well, that's exactly what I wanted you to say. That was a really unique period. So Comcast Interactive Media, where we worked, was kind of this separate experimentation unit, but we were also making big bets, some meaningful investments in acquiring properties, in growing our audience. This was both before and during and after the NBC Universal first joint venture and that transaction. So there were some really meaningful problems that we were trying to solve about customer value and growing an audience.
Yeah, I think it was a great time for us. It was inspiring to see such a large company carve out a group of individuals to be very entrepreneurial. We obviously created and changed, I feel we created and changed the culture of Comcast, and the work that we did there was the foundational work that drove, if anybody is a Comcast customer and uses X1, is the foundation for the X1 video experience and the cloud-based video platform that I ended up, fortunately, my blessing was ended up running for the last, 4 to 5 years. So that was a great experience, and it all started with what we did at SIM.
Yeah, SIM, Comcast Interactive Media. So I remember when I joined SIM, I first worked for a gentleman, our friend Sean Wechter, who led the kind of the technical operations side of things. So analytics reporting into operations. And then after a year or so of that, I started working for Krishan Bhatia, who led our strategy kind of and some business development kind of partnership, M&A kind of activity. Reported to Krishan for a couple of years. And then and there were some benefits of having analytics and strategy together. And then for the latter half of my time at Comcast, anyway, I reported to you, finance, and we had a good relationship at that point, so it made complete sense to me. But I was a little surprised when pretty early on you came to me and said, okay, we're going to have a financial close meeting and a metrics close meeting. We're going to take your metrics and we're going to look at them every month. And when we get together to talk about the financials, we're also going to get together to talk about analytics and the metrics and what's going on. And I'd love for you to share kind of what you had in mind there. What was your aim in doing that?
I have always felt, I think your experience is reflective of, at that time, what many organizations kind of felt about analytics. One was, okay, it tells me about how the product is working. I needed to think about strategy. And then my evolution was, I believe that analytics and finance are essentially one and the same thing. Our ultimate goal is to create value through data points, right? The finance organization just does it through money. The analytics organization does it through customer behavior, errors, and other things. And by bringing those two things together, it creates a robust picture of value, and allowed me as a finance person to develop, much more sophisticated models to predict the future, which, at the time, given the limitations we had, they were pretty broad, i.e. very averages. But I think as we look at the evolution of the loyalty-based economy, and we'll talk about it later, we're going to see that capability set drop down to a customer level. And I think that's the natural evolution. And if you bring those two things together, given the ability to manage it now with software and databases and, analytics packages, then you can start managing at a one-to-one level. We're not going to be there yet. Those muscles need to start getting flexed. And we were just at the edge of that, David. Like, that's where we were starting.
Yeah, it was kind of challenging at first. I mean, obviously, you had this grand vision of where you were going. I think I bought into that pretty quickly, but I remember it being challenging. What do you what are from your experience, your recollection, some of the challenges that why is it so hard to get there?
I think there's probably cultural issues that are out there. It's hard for organizations to begin to see those two things coming together. At least it used to be hard. I think it's a lot less hard now. I also think the standpoint is there are a lot of metrics that can be tracked, and you need to narrow that focus down. And, I divide the world into two subjects. One is, what do you need to develop those financial reporting and models on a monthly basis? And then what do you need to do analysis on? Two very different requirements. And then I think the third thing that you kind of get to in the long run there is you have to get really comfortable with the consistency of the pace. And that consistency in order to be taken at that level of maturity, you have to be consistent. You have to close at the same time. You have to have the same processes. And that's evolved a lot since we started, with governance and other elements. But I still think there's opportunity for maturity in that space too, to continue to evolve.
Yeah, I remember early on expressing some, I guess, maybe reluctance or questioning. Well, we don't have this data point yet from an analytics perspective. We didn't have one metric or another that you wanted to represent in this monthly close meeting, or maybe there was a scenario where we knew we would have a particular metric in another day. We needed a day to get something from ComScore or something like that. I asked, should we postpone the meeting? And you said, absolutely not. You hold the meeting. If you don't have the data, you leave it blank on the paper, and then that creates this, I guess, incentive, because you kind of felt the heat of that in this month. So you work harder to get it next month, either through a forecast or just by working earlier. And that took a little bit of getting used to for me, but I continue to refer to that time and time again, that you just go ahead and hold the meeting and create that demand later on.
Yeah, I think that's a big change, or at least, as you and I work together, and I still see it with some of the analytics teams that I work with, which is the big change is you have to get comfortable with it. The timeline is important, and that there's ambiguity that you have to deal with in order to make that timeline. And it takes time to develop the sophistication to deal with that ambiguity, because most people look at the finance org and they're like, oh my God, what if I'm wrong? And the answer is not what if I'm wrong. It's am I consistent, and am I doing it the same way over and over again? Because, by the way, finance is not always right either. So don't let them kid you.
Analytics can learn so much from finance in that regard, that finance has decades, maybe centuries. I don't know. You can tell me how long this has been around, but to sort of wrestle with this ambiguity and analytics, maybe we put too much pressure on ourselves. it takes a while to get there. How long do you remember it takes? Did it take until you felt like we were measuring up to your ambition or what you wanted us to be?
Well, I think the answer is, it's a process. Did you not measure up? I don't think that's the right way to look at it. I think you were learning something new, and finance was learning something new. So it's a process of being better every time. It's almost agile in that construct, which is you just start. In the finance world, things take about a year, right? If you think about finance in that, you've got 12 months to close books. It takes you a couple of months to get it right. And then you're moving on. But by the way, you also have forecasts and you have one budget. So in all cases, finance is going to take a year to get good. And I think, you use the monthly process to work out your kinks. You use the forecast to train your models appropriately. If we start talking about AI and machine learning, you got to train on those things. You want to do one or two finance forecasts where your metrics are driving results to the company. And then you got a budget, and you have to be ready for that budget. Because if you are successful in meeting those two things, being in the budget as part of that process, which I suspect most people are now, then you will become a core metric for the company. And you can see those core metrics starting to come out even on SEC filings now. How many customers do you have? What's the monthly active? How many customers did you acquire last month, this month? What's their retention rates? These are things that are analytics, but are driving finance. And that's why we want to bring them together. That's why I always want to bring them together.
Right. The concept of having analytics numbers represented, get a little echo there, represented in an SEC filing, for example, or mentioned on a call with Wall Street, it raises the stakes. And so clearly analytics, if they're going to have their numbers contribute to those conversations, they need to learn a bit from finance as to how to manage those interactions. Are there any lessons that come to mind for you that you'd share with the audience here around what analytics can learn from finance?
Yeah, I think the number one thing that I try to stress is the analytics team has to be independent, right? And that sometimes is a problem because historically they might have been part of the operations unit or the product unit, or they might be part of the marketing unit. And those structures have agency problems. And when I say that, the agency problem is they want to do what's right, but they want to do what's right through their lens. And it's not always the right thing for the company. And therefore, independence is what finance is. Finance has no other obligation except for making sure the numbers are right and they reflect the value that was created from the customers. And if analytics can mirror that and just take that stance that no matter what the result is, that's not what's important. What's important is that we capture the data properly and that it reflects what was happening out there appropriately. Then you become trusted. And once you become trusted, you then will penetrate the entire organization because people will find your value consistent, repeatable, and trusted. And they will be able to make decisions off of it. And I think that's probably one of the most important things to adjust in the org. The organization then has to adopt to that. Obviously, finance has its own language. Analytics has its own language. You need to find a common barrier or a common commonality in language there, because you can't be talking past each other. And then narrow your focus, right? There's a lot to do out there. Find the things that are important to each of the respective agencies and narrow down onto those things and do the work to try to help them narrow down. I think what I have found is most people get lost in data and they want more of it. They think it's kind of fear of missing out. There's a critical piece out there that's going to change the way I think about the business. That's highly unlikely. Yeah. And so if you can, and I think this is the job of the analytics team, shape everybody else to think about what's important. I found great analytics teams nurture their constituency.
Well, similarly, I think back on you and some of our other our coworkers from the finance side of things, like Doug Chekai, great storytellers with numbers from a financial perspective. And I think analytics has an obligation and an opportunity, I think, to tell the rest, to up the data storytelling game of the rest of the organization. And therefore sort of that trust continues to build because you're telling compelling stories. What other lessons can flipping the previous question around what can analytics learn from finance, what can finance learn from analytics?
I think at least what I've taken away from analytics when I've worked with them is that we have to consider what I call secondary and third degree of metrics that impact financials. As we look at this loyalty-based economy, the key indicators, the leading indicators probably are not financial. In my world, in media, it's how much usage, how many times did they interact with it? And those things then become predictive of what the value of that customer will be. The other thing I've learned from analytics organizations was, machine learning, AI, predictive technologies, those things that help us narrow our ability down, not only to what metrics matter, but also what will the results be given a range. I think depending on who you're talking to in finance, if they are less mature financially, they're going to want specificity, i.e., what's the number? And I think analytics teaches me it's not a number, right? It's a range of possibility, a probability. Yeah. And therefore, the finance org has to get better at managing that risk of probability. The mature finance organizations understand that. The immature ones don't, and they need to be taught. Not in a pejorative way, but in a, nurtured in that there's a range. And I think some of those things are the powerful tools that analytics brings to bear. I think those things are very, very informative and helpful for finance, because in the end, finance and analytics, as you know, from my perspective, need to come together to build better predictions of how customers will react, as well as where to invest the money to support growth of that customer base or new customers or new product lines.
Well, yeah, that's really interesting. Let's go a little bit deeper into the customer perspective. You've said before, and we used it in the titling of this program today, that every customer is a business.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little more about what you mean by that.
When I look at the world, and I'm looking at it through my lens, it can be, a customer can be changed. So please don't take my perspective as dogma, but I work in a direct-to-customer relationship, and each customer's interactions with the companies I work with reflect either a payment of dollars or a value creation moment, i.e. they received something of value. Mostly a dollar paid is the highest form of congratulations you can get. Now, you want to get it in a way that makes the customer happy and they receive the value they expected from it. And I think there's some areas where Comcast had fallen down, continues to fall down, and is working to change that. But in that construct, it's about each customer. Now, if we back up in time, we haven't had the ability to manage at that level, right? It's just been impossible to do that. You can't have enough people to manage it. However, now with databases, with analytics packages, with tagging, most things being digital or moving to a digital perspective, you can start to develop a robust profile of an individual at a customer level. They can be aggregated as needed, but ultimately it's at a customer level. That's what, David, you taught me, right? We can get down that low. And then you start linking that to the baseline. So if you think about finance, there's this discipline called cost accounting, which was trying to allocate cost at a level, a very low level. But you can start to say, hey, how much did it cost me to acquire that customer? How much resources am I putting into that customer? And what would I do with that customer? Some customers are awesome. You want to spend a lot of money making them happy because they spend a lot of money with you. Other customers are trying you out, and you might want to invest, but not too much money. And that's what I mean by getting to this customer level of each customer is its own business line. And if you take that analogy, you can apply it to anything you do. Each, from a business to business, your partner is a customer, and you can understand how you create value. Should you create more value with them, invest more? And that's what finance does. We allocate resources, we do those things. And so by doing it at that level, we get much more sophisticated at the value we're creating, as well as the value of the business that we're running.
Right.
On average, everybody will use averages, and that's very misleading. As you know, if you think about in the media space, it's not a bell curve, right? It's actually an asymptotic curve. You got a lot of people up on a sampling structure, and a very few people creating enormous amount of value over long periods of time.
Right.
And so how you manage those two things is important. And I suspect that's the case for a lot of businesses.
So it certainly applies in media. It definitely applies in retail to some extent. You've got few customers who are your really good customers. I agree. It applies in a lot of businesses. And so segmenting that audience and presenting them with different targeted solutions and investing differently for them, I think makes a lot of sense. What about our listeners? If you have questions, our audience, feel free to enter any questions in the various chat boxes of the platform where you are consuming this program, and we will endeavor to respond. Kind of coming into the home stretch here of our conversation,
Sure.
but let's talk about culture for a minute. What are some reflections from your time at AOL and Comcast about creating a culture? And actually, I'll share one thing about culture at Comcast was that there was, when I joined late 2006, Comcast was not a loved company, and
Not at all.
And then throughout my time there, it gradually maybe got a little better. But I remember avoiding telling people that I worked at Comcast because I didn't want to hear them complain about their Comcast service. Now I'm a Comcast customer on the outside of things. And early on, when I left in 2013, my first interaction with Comcast as a customer was just horrendous. It was awful. And I thought, oh, this is what it's like on the outside. I understand now. But I would say over the last 7 years since that time, 8 years now almost, it's gotten a lot better. Comcast has really improved its focus on the customer. And I would suspect that there's something to do with culture within the company. So the question isn't necessarily about Comcast and how it's improved. It's more about how companies can use culture. What do they need to pay attention to in order to be better stewards and practitioners of data, both finance and analytics, hopefully with an aim toward improving their relationships with customers as well.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I'm going to try to shape it a little bit to this audience, which is when you think about this, and I continue to go back to this loyalty-based economy, it's actually the marriage of these things that creates the culture, right? Comcast internally decided that it wanted to change its perspective with the customers. We struggled with figuring out how to do that because we were so rigidly financed, right? Well, we're making $1 here today. Why would we give up that $1 today? And it was through one of our colleagues, Charlie Heron, who, through some of the work we did, David, influenced him to think about, well, how do you think about the customer? And we ultimately settled on a metric, a non-financial metric, NPS, as the driver of that. However, it's NPS measured as an analytical metric that is married to the financials. And ultimately, that was a reflection of customer satisfaction and a bunch of different things, their experiences. married then to financial statements. And what that does, when it's adopted at the highest level of the organization and it becomes part of the organization's value creation incentive model, right? Not just finance, but a metric, then all of a sudden you start to make change. Why? Because we're incented to make change. Because if you're not incented to make the trade-off, to take the risk of losing that dollar or changing that customer behavior, then the organization won't, because they're not going to be rewarded for that behavior. And that's an important aspect, I think, of this discussion, which is why analytics and finance together can have such a profound impact on an organization, because it allows finance to trade off the desire to want to create money today for creating money in the future.
The short-term, long-term trade-off.
And it's such a tension within every organization. And it's only through analytics that you can validate or demonstrate that by making that trade, you're taking less risk than you think you are. And you can create more value in the long term, which leads us finally to that construct of moving out of a monthly close, but looking at things over long periods of time and training and training AI, training ML in order to use long periods. Horizontal measurement is an important aspect too.
That takes a lot of discipline and a long-term focus. I think that can start from the bottom, but probably most likely, as you said, starts from the top, senior level. Certainly, having seen that evolution at Comcast and working with you, I definitely agree with what you're saying there. Any closing thoughts, Daniel, as we wrap it up?
No, I think that was a great closing position where, I believe strongly in NPS, and I believe that there's more work to be done on creating that long-term customer value proposition at that level to show businesses that the marriage of finance, that finance is actually a marriage of analytics to long-term value creation, and you invest appropriately across that. I think those two things are critical as we move into the next stage of business. And by the way, the technology is now allowing us to do it. And from that standpoint, we should start exercising the muscles to be more successful.
Absolutely. Very bright future, and one that will be, I think, more appropriately realized when thinking long-term through an analytics lens and through a finance lens together. Well, Daniel, thank you for sharing some of that experience and knowledge. I know I have benefited greatly from working closely with you. I hope our audience has taken a sliver of that away today. So really appreciate your taking the time to be here with us today.
It's my pleasure. It's great to see you again. So thank you for inviting me on, and happy to answer anything you have in the future.
Great. So thank you all for joining. David McBride from Course 5. Thanks again to Daniel Spinosa, our guest today, and have a wonderful day.
Take care.
Bye.